So thanks for joining us this morning to talk about the Procurement Bill. My name's Caroline and I'm Policy and National Programmes Manager at Lloyds Bank Foundation. We're hosting this event in partnership with NCVO and alongside a number of charity partners, including Children England, Directive of Social Change, CAF and Charity Finance Group, because we know that procurement is an issue of real interest to the charities we work with. So we're going to be kicking off with some presentations, so ask that you can remain on mute while we're in plenary. There will be a chance for discussion in breakout rooms later, so you can come off mute then. We are recording the session. You've hopefully just had a notice telling you that that's the case. If you'd like to make sure your picture doesn't appear on the recording, you're welcome to turn off your camera, but it'd be great if you're able to, if you could turn it back on when we move into breakout groups later as well. We have only got 1 hour, so won't have time for lots of questions outside of the breakout room discussion. But do feel free to drop any questions in the chat and we'll aim to pick them up outside of the session where we can. And we'll also share the slides and the recording after the session. So don't worry about trying to scribble down what is on the slides. So as you're aware, as you're here today, the Procurement Bill sets out the new rules that contracting authorities will need to follow when carrying out procurement. So will impact those of you delivering contracts, such as for public services for the local authority. We've organised this session to give you an overview of the bill for charities. So if you haven't had the pleasure of reading the full document, we will hopefully give you a quick overview, but also give you a chance to help shape the changes that we're seeking to influence for charities. We're going to start off the session by hearing from Ed Green, who's Deputy Director at the Cabinet Office, to outline government's ambitions through the Procurement Bill, as well as how it will be progressing through Parliament. I'll then run through some key parts of the bill that we think are significant for charities. Before Sam, who's Policy and Insight Manager at NCVO, will run through where we think the bill can be strengthened, and you'll have a chance to share your thoughts in those discussion groups as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ed to the session to talk through what government is hoping to achieve.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and good morning, everyone. Delighted to be able to talk to you today. Thank you very much to Lloyds Bank Foundations and your partners for letting me do so. As Caroline said, I'm Ed Green. I'm the Deputy Director for Commercial Policy, International and Reform in the Cabinet Office. That means I'm responsible for the Procurement Bill and the other strands of work to implement that I'll touch on very briefly. And I'm also responsible for the UK's procurement obligations in international free trade agreements, working with Department of International Trade very closely. What I thought I'd do is just outline a little bit about where we've come from and what the objectives are, as Caroline said. I'll mention one or two provisions that I think might be of particular interest to charities without hopefully preempting what Caroline plans to say after me. And then I'll talk a little bit about our implementation activity, because how we implement this is absolutely critical, and the bill is by no means the end of the story. So leaving the EU, we believe, has given us a real opportunity to reform and streamline and simplify our procurement rules and create a regime that's much better designed to suit the UK's particular needs, rather than being an instrument of the EU single market and designed to further that primarily. We do have international procurement obligations that we need to comply with, because that gives UK suppliers access to opportunities all around the world. So one of those is the World Trade Organization's government procurement agreement, which is worth about £1.3 trillion. So it's important for certain sectors that we keep our markets open and transparent, and non-discriminatory, so that UK firms can sell overseas as well. A lot of the sectors you'll be interested in aren't actually covered by trade agreements, so there's a bit more flexibility there in many respects. But I thought I'd set that out because it explains why the bill looks broadly how it does. We started this process some years ago, back in 2019. We did a lot of stakeholder consultation about now that we had the opportunity to reform procurement, what should it look like. We set up a procurement transformation advisory panel, which had inputs from NGOs, from academics, from experts in international best practice, from business leaders, and from contracting authorities. And they then fed into the proposals that we included in the Transforming Public Procurement Green Paper back in 2020. We published a government response to that at the end of 2021, and we have now, as you'll be aware, introduced the Procurement Bill into the House of Lords. So what are some of the key things that we're seeking to achieve then through the Procurement Bill? I talked about simplification. So we've consolidated all the existing procurement legislation across different sectors such as defence, utilities, concessions, so that's hospital shops, toll roads and public contracts. So for those suppliers and public bodies that operate across those regimes, that should be much simpler. We've stripped down the number of different procedures that procurement used to interact with. So under the EU procurement rules, there were 7. We've reduced that number to 3, and one of those might be of particular interest because essentially it's a flexible procedure that contracting authorities can design in consultation with the market, in pre-market engagement, for instance, and as long as they comply with the basic rules around non-discrimination and advertising, they can design a procedure best suited to delivering the service that they're trying to buy, rather than being constrained by having to follow a certain route set out in our regulations which transpose the directives. And why that's quite important is, it wouldn't have to exclusively rely on written tenders. You could have things like demonstrations for research and development. If you're designing a new service, you could research, develop, and buy that through this process with partners coming on and off. So something that we think should provide real benefit and help stimulate innovation. Be much more transparent. So not just publishing notices to advertise contracts and award contracts, but actually publishing stuff up front. So where pipelines of opportunities are contemplated, you can see what those opportunities are going to be for contracts over a certain size in larger public bodies, and that'll let organisations gear up to deliver, as well as an early market engagement notice. So once you've started pre-market engagement, contracting authorities will be able to publish a notice again to flag the possibility to participate, and then more information at the end of the procurement. So okay, you've let the contract, taxpayers, citizens, we ourselves, other suppliers will want to know how that contract's performing, when might it be up for renewal. So much more data at the end of the process. One of the changes that we're introducing, which I think will be of most interest to charities, we were originally going to remove the light touch regime, which will be the regime many of you who compete for contracts are familiar with, because we felt that actually the flexible procedure I described earlier ought to do most of what the light touch regime did, and perhaps offered a few more extra benefits and flexibilities. We received quite strong representations from both local governments and charities and other types of VCSEs in particular during the consultation process, that actually this would be problematic. It would mean that contracts of significantly lower value would be brought into the light touch rate, be brought into the scope of the rules if we did that, because light touch contracts had a slightly higher threshold, and other issues as well. And we were also very conscious of recommendations from the House of Lords Public Services Committee around the time that we were doing the Green Paper around, is procurement always quite right in these circumstances? Does it adequately cater for some of the sorts of services that charities and other VCSEs provide? We've always said it's sort of supplier neutral, but nonetheless, are these sorts of processes best designed to deliver these sorts of services? So one of the changes, and we hope you'll view it as an improvement we've made to the light touch regime, is that the bill proposes, if there is some sort of user choice in legislation, so a service user has a say over the services, then under the procurement rules, that contract can be directly awarded. because obviously it was a little difficult under the current regime where there is a user choice and a need to run a competition. How does that particularly square itself? So a provision in the bill will let us come forward with regulations to allow that to happen. Obviously there's loads more in the bill, but conscious I've only got 10 minutes. We have done a webinar or a series of webinars, and we've posted that on YouTube if you want more detail about the bill generally. It's for a more general audience, but that is up on our site, on our Cabinet Office procurement site, and I can circulate a link with that on the Transforming Public Procurement webpage. The bill isn't the whole story, as I alluded to earlier, that there will be some detail in what we call secondary legislation, so regulations introduced after the bill. And what we're proposing to do there is, for instance, provide the details of the different transparency notices that will be required, what sorts of information needs to go in those notices. There's an interaction between our bill and the Health and Care Act 2022, which introduces the provider selection regime in the NHS, which some of you might be familiar with. And as DHSC bring forward their regulations, we'll need to make sure that our legislation intersects properly with that. So there'll be some secondary legislation around that as well. And we're also building a digital platform to host all this transparency information and ensure that the regime can function as intended. And just finally, learning and development and implementation is going to be absolutely critical. So there'll be comprehensive training aimed in particular at the contracting authorities that need to implement the regime, but clearly we'll be making materials available for providers, for charities providing public services, and indeed other suppliers. So there will be material available. In terms of timescales, obviously we're dependent on the parliamentary process at the minute. I said we're introduced in the House of Lords. The bill will make its way through. There will then, as I say, be secondary legislation, and we've committed to a 6-month implementation period so that people can take advantage of the learning and development materials we want to make available, and so that they really are geared up to deliver this new regime when we switch it on. So we can't give a precise date, but it's going to be sort of 2023 at the earliest. Conscious of time, so I think I'm just about out of time. So Caroline, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ed. That was really helpful, and hopefully everyone has found that useful as a kind of overview of what government are hoping to get from the bill. I have posted an email address into the chat where, if you do have questions that you wanted to ask the bill team, you can direct them to that procurement.reform email address that's in the chat. So that's procurement.reform@cabinetoffice.gov.uk to hopefully pick up on any specific questions that you've got. I'm now going to move on to pull out some of the elements that we think are particularly interesting in the bill in terms of charities, and some of these will reflect what Ed has said as well. But I think we've tried to identify ones where they feel like there could be specific responses to issues that we have heard from charities are particularly problematic when it comes to procurement in particular. As a starting point, it's worth acknowledging that we're aware that commissioning and procurement can be particularly problematic and challenging for charities, particularly smaller charities. So that's, I guess, our starting point, and we're trying to identify actually how might some of these challenges be addressed. There is a lot in the bill, as Ed outlined, and after all, it aims to bring together a lot of different legislation into one place, and covers a huge range of procurements. So that means there's lots of big areas that we won't even touch on today, but we've just tried to identify where there are opportunities in the bill that might help overcome some of the challenges that charities face, and also where there are opportunities for the legislation potentially to improve the services that people can access as well. So if you were able to read the briefing document that we circulated in advance, no doubt these things will be familiar. We can obviously only give a very high level overview of some of the key points this morning, but hopefully it will just give you a flavour of some of the key areas of interest. So firstly, I wanted to pull out the reference to preliminary market engagement. So we know that this can be a big stumbling block where contracting authorities have avoided engaging with suppliers out of fear of breaking competition rules. But we also know that where it has happened previously, it's been really effective. So for example, we worked with Capacity Public Services Lab in the Wirral, where they actually did engage with local providers, help them to prepare for a forthcoming procurement process, and it meant the results that they had through that process were much more effective, and charities were much better able to participate in it. So actually being able to, so having the legislation outline that can be done is really helpful. And particularly building those relationships with suppliers as well, we know is so important in terms of helping to understand what is even deliverable. So hopefully that would happen at the kind of commissioning research stage, but all part of, I guess, building those relationships between suppliers and contracting authorities. The bill also encourages contracting authorities to split contracts into smaller lots, which could help to address the shift we've seen to much larger scale, more generic contracts, which can prevent smaller providers from competing. So this duty to consider whether large contracts can be reasonably broken down is kind of trying to encourage that behaviour that we want to see more often. And I think that relates to what Ed mentioned in his slot, where he was talking about the bill making, kind of introducing these more flexible procedures, which can enable much better procurement practice. But what we've tried to pick out is where there are specific things that are encouraging that better practice that we really want to see across the board. Next step, we know that too often approaches are not proportionate to the service or scale of the contract, and that can be problematic to charities and to contracting authorities themselves. So it's positive that there are some specific references to proportionality in relation to the nature, complexity and scale of the service that is being procured. It's also positive to see clarification that decisions should be awarded to the most advantageous tender rather than most economically advantageous tender, as in previous legislation. In theory, we'd hope this would discourage decisions from being made on a lowest unit cost basis, which too often means poor quality services that leave people needing more support in the long run, and a lack of recognition of the wider benefits that can be delivered by charities, as highlighted in some research that we've published previously about the value of small charities. Ed also mentioned about the inclusion of light touch contracts. So as he mentioned, last year the government set out their intentions to kind of remove specific reference to light touch contracts within the new, more flexible regime. And we highlighted the reason that we thought the light touch contracts were important was because they distinguished between different types of services. And for us, the real kind of important element is that people services, so services that are person-centered, are kind of different and therefore require different processes to purchasing other goods and works, for example. So it's helpful that that they're included still in the bill, to have some form of acknowledgement that actually, yes, you should be thinking about the services that you're delivering and how they might be different depending if they're people's services or other goods and works. So, buying an IT system for a government department, for example. You don't need to worry about the bill text in the italics here. We just wanted to flag that this approach is outlined in the bill, and it's kind of that principle of what it encourages. So while these are positive moves, I'm just going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk through how we think the bill could be further improved and support participation of charities and high quality services, to really try and make sure that flexibility that I'd mentioned, which should enable contracting authorities to use better approaches, kind of happens in practice. So Sam.
Thanks very much, Caroline. So as we have said many times this morning, this is a massive bill. It's very, very detailed. So we're just kind of skimming along the surface of what is included in there. So as Caroline mentioned, with the preservation of the idea of light touch contracts, while we find that really positive, that the government clearly listened to responses that they received through the consultation, it is really key that person-centered services for people, often people who are experiencing kind of complex and overlapping difficulties in their lives, are distinguished from purchasing goods and works. And obviously this bill is trying to cover every possible thing that could be procured. And so we would like to see kind of greater recognition of the difference between public services and other types of goods and works. We would also like to see a greater focus on social value. So the concept of social value is actually not in the text of the bill. The bill refers to the National Procurement Policy Statement, which at the moment speaks to social value and what is considered to be included in that. But that statement can be changed by the minister and by Parliament. And so it doesn't kind of crystallize social value as a fundamental concept that underpins procurement. And within that, we have spoken for many years about the inherent kind of social value that is delivered by not just what charities provide and do, but the way that they do it. Charities and social enterprises alike, and the kind of values that they hold and the ethos that they bring to the work that they do. As Caroline mentioned, it's great that proportionality is mentioned throughout the bill, but it's not held up as a fundamental principle or objective. At the very start, the bill sets out the objectives that underpin the entire procurement kind of regime, and proportionality is not one of them. And so we would like to see a stronger message sent that process should not come first. Kind of purpose should drive what the process then looks like, and that's especially important for services for people. And then we've actually, I think Teresa's question in the chat links to this idea of bid candy. So we know that an issue, there can be an issue with smaller charities in particular being included in bids, and then not receiving any referrals, not actually in practice being part of delivering that service. We have, so the bill is currently in committee in the House of Lords, which means they are spending massive amounts of time debating in the neighborhood of 600 amendments that have been tabled to change the bill. And there's at least one amendment that has been tabled to try and strengthen the accountability of lead providers to actually include anyone who is in their bid in the delivery of that service. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just also trying to read your questions and getting distracted, but we can come back to the points that are being made in the chat. So as I'd mentioned, there are requirements in the bill around different kinds of notices. So pipeline notices where an authority, contracting authority, expects that they're going to be spending a certain amount in the coming financial year. Preliminary market engagement notices, planned procurement notices where the contracting authority is about to start procuring a procurement process. But at the moment in the bill, these are kind of enabled. So contracting authorities may publish these things, but they don't in all circumstances have to. And we think that that should be reversed. They should have to, unless there is a good reason why, that will, undermine that procurement process. In particular, if there's a good reason that being transparent in that way would affect the service and the people who are using the service, because obviously there are situations that we kind of can't foresee, but we would like to see a much stronger expectation of communication and transparency. And similarly, so with the provision for preliminary market engagement, that is enabled in the bill, which is really positive. But we are concerned about some of the wording around giving potential providers an unfair advantage through preliminary market engagement, and that could have a chilling effect. So it might mean that contracting authorities don't want to carry out market engagement because they're worried about unintentionally conferring an unfair advantage. And it may mean that potential providers don't want to engage because they're also worried about that, and about not being able to participate once the procurement process starts in earnest. And actually, to the point about people with lived experience, yeah. So part of what we would ideally see in the kind of the entire commissioning cycle is enough time. So what all of this is about, the transparency and preliminary market engagement, that's about giving the right people, so whether that's a charity, whether that's people in a community, enough time to work out what is needed and work out how best to provide that. And so what all of these kind of different points are, I kind of picture it as like scaffolding around what we would like to see as the kind of ideal commissioning process that involves the actual people who are going to be using that service. So kind of linked to social value, we'd also like to see a kind of stronger, broader, and wider definition of value for money. So value for money is mentioned multiple times throughout the bill. It's not really defined. It's kind of taken to mean best price often in practice. That's what it ends up meaning. And it's not typically understood to include things like long-term savings, savings for other services, or, you know, benefits that aren't financial, such as improved outcomes for the people who are using the services. And the last thing that I will bring up in this kind of extremely rapid overview is we would like to see limitations on arbitrary conditions of participation. So I'm sure if you have been interested in bidding for a contract in the past, you may have encountered kind of arbitrary financial thresholds. You know, the organization has to have a minimum income of X in order to bid, or, you know, the organization has to have delivered a contract in the past that's much bigger than the contract on offer. So we know that this is a major barrier to smaller charities in particular, but charities and social enterprises bidding. I believe it's the Federation of Small Businesses did a bit of research and found that most of their members did not go for contracts over about £100,000. I can dig out that research and share it in the chat, but we know that the organizations we're working with, you know, are often going for much smaller contracts, and so having these arbitrary thresholds just locks them out. Next slide, please. So just to touch on some of the work that we've been doing. So we've worked with peers in the House of Lords to table amendments around these issues. We've been meeting with officials, so with civil servants and the bill team in particular, to talk about, you know, what Ed was saying, that kind of the next stages around secondary legislation and guidance and implementation as well. Localities Keep It Local program focuses on better commissioning at a local level. So that's been an area of their kind of research and member engagement. I mean, underpinning all of this, right, is the need for increased funding for local authorities. And that's kind of a much bigger area than just the procurement bill. And then NCBO did a project called Rebalancing the Relationship, where the focus was a little bit different. We looked at the relationships between large charities and small charities, and kind of what enables collaboration, what puts a damper on collaboration, and how charities can work better together. Next slide, please. So some of the next steps in the procurement bill's trajectory. As you may know, things are a little up in the air with the government right now, but we expect this bill to at least make it through committee stage before recess. So that means peers will discuss all of the amendments before Parliament goes away for the summer and comes back in September. Next, it will be in report stage in the House of Lords. We expect it to make it into the House of Commons probably October time. And at that point, we'll be doing more work on engaging MPs. And that will also involve sharing resources and support for you to engage MPs and to tell them kind of the story of why this is critical to you and your organization. And we'll be working with officials as well on, as I said, developing the guidance that will accompany this legislation and supporting the implementation of the new bill.